As we pick up in chapter 5, we come to the Naaman story. And the Naaman story is known by everybody. And the question is why? Well, because in the Old Testament, there are very few stories that really show God's love for the nations, God's eventual salvation plan for other nations. What you see in the Old Testament is a focus on God's elect Israel and God's gradual and occasional bringing of people into that. But the majority of it is the descendants of Abraham. God, in fact, allows people to live, born, live, and die lost, completely lost. The majority of human history before the coming of Christ, simply put, God was working with a handful of people, and everyone else was excluded from God's redemptive plan. That's his prerogative. And so when you look at stories like Naaman, where God, in fact, does go to the nation and save someone out of that, create an Old Testament saint from those who are lost, you got to ask the question, well, okay, well, why, first of all? But second of all, okay, so God's love is broader than just simply Abraham. And you'll also notice in the story that the Arameans don't come to an Old Testament belief. They're not changed at all. The nation is not transformed. It's just Naaman. Naaman perhaps his wife. And so you look at these stories and they become sort of emblematic and typological of a coming salvation that incorporates all of the nations. And so then Isaiah can be fulfilled, the idea that all of the nations will stream to the mountain of the Lord. It's an eventual thing. And so we call this sort of a proto-theological setup, before the theology of the Gentiles comes in. You see these connections. Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master, highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. And so with the Old Testament and Near Eastern attitude towards leprosy, why would you have a guy like Naaman around? Well, because he probably became famous and important before he became a leper. It also should be known that leprosy historically is a contagious disease among those who can get it, but it's only a minority of people who can actually contract leprosy. And so in some places, at some times, people learn to live with it. And you live with it when there's a guy like Naaman who God is using and he's overwhelmingly successful. You live with it. You live with this disease that everybody hates, seems terrified, and of course, to a certain degree, he's excluded from a broader society because of it. But what do you do? What do you do? Well, it also could be that it's a different form of leprosy. Leprosy was generally noted as any skin condition. But either way, people looked at that with a bit of askance. Could be psoriasis or those kinds of things. And people viewed those things as real mark of disfavor, and yet at the same time, Naaman's disproportionately successful as a warrior. What do you do about that? Well, you live with it. That's what you do. And so we pick up here in this story again in verse 2. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands, had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who's in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. Now, a couple things to note here. This is God's plan playing out. God uses a little girl who is enslaved, who's been snatched away from her parents, from her family, who's been disconnected from her nation, who's outside of the land of blessing. Why would that ever be God's plan? Well, it's what I've often said. God will break the world apart to get to your heart, and God is simply, it's about Him, not about you. God will, in fact, incorporate in His working all sorts of injustices, all sorts of complicated things like slavery, and in fact, the history of slavery in the Old Testament is in fact complex. And slavery in general is much more complex than we wish to treat it. We want to treat it as a malum in se, as this thing should not be tolerated, that God always hates, and that's simply not the case. God does not always hate slavery. He doesn't call it sin in itself. Certainly there are forms of slavery that are evil and certainly should never be tolerated by good societies. But people have all taken their turn being enslaved. My ancestors, the Irish, were in fact sold into slavery by the British and others, including our good friend Oliver Cromwell, for a period of time. That's just the way that is, you know. And so it will always be that way. And so here you have a little girl, and as she's snatched into slavery, she also develops a fondness for her mistress and her master. And also notice she becomes a witness of God's work. Isn't that amazing? God can use a slave, and even though he's not changing the Arameans, he has one particular Aramean that he's going to change. And that's a pretty exciting sort of setup, isn't it? So we pick up in verse 4. Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus spoke the girl who's from the land of Israel." So Naaman goes to his boss who loves him, his boss who thinks the world of him, his boss who would not be in the position that he's in except for Naaman. And so that's also a pretty cool thing. Then the king of Aram said, "Go now, I will send a letter to the king of Israel." He departed, took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. This is not a small amount, not even clothing. Clothing, people, and I've talked about this before, was incredibly expensive and difficult up to recently, about 150 years ago. Up till then, it was very difficult to keep a society fed and clothed, and yet now it's as easy a thing in the world as we can imagine. For now, right? For now, until the whole thing falls apart, but there you go. And so the king of Aram says, go to the king of Israel, take all these things, get this dealt with. I'm sure it's difficult for him having a captain of the army who's diseased, and visibly so, especially in a culture that may look on such things as a mark of God against him. So he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, "And now, as this letter comes to you, behold, I've sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy." Now, I believe that's a quote from that letter. That's a pretty neat thing to have. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me." And so the unbelieving northern king of Israel, who's lost, he doesn't think in terms of what God can do. He's just lost in his paganism. He gets this letter from the king of Aram, and he thinks politically, this guy is out to get me. This is obviously, by handing me a task that there's no way of doing, certainly this is just a trick to get me into a war. And he goes to hopelessness. Now, I also think this is a particular mark of being lost. Things that should not make you hopeless will make you hopeless. And I think that's actually a real benefit to the Christian. We can actually look at a disaster. We could look at something like this and say, God is doing something, and approaching it with a bit more positive of an attitude. After all, our God's a God of miracle. And that is borne out in the next verse. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God?" Pick up verse 8. It happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard of the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know there's a prophet in Israel." And what you see here is a remarkable setup. A setup that will change the life of Naaman and presumably his wife, but also one that may purchase a little peace for Israel, as Naaman, the captain of the Aramean cohort of soldiers, sees that they have a real prophet, that their God is a God of real power. And so there may be more than one payoff at the end of this story.